Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. This is part of the cross-country tour for my latest book, A Propaganda System: How Canada's Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation. And basically this is a book about information dissemination and suppression in Canadian foreign policy. It's trying to answer the question, why are we so confused about our government's place in the world? Despite a long history of Canada sporting empire, historically the British, today the American, advancing Canadian corporate interests abroad, Canadians overwhelmingly think this country is a force for good internationally. So this book is trying to answer that question. Why is that? How many people in this room have heard of something called the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti? Some people? I know some people have. Many, maybe fewer than I thought. Basically, it was a meeting that Canadian government officials called in early 2003 to plot the overthrow of the elected government in Haiti. And on January 31st and February 1st of 2003, Canadian officials brought top officials from the Bush administration in the US, from the minister from the French government, top officials from the Organization of American States. And as reported on L'Actualité magazine on March 15th, 2003, they decided that Aristide, the elected president, must go. Haiti should be put under UN trusteeship, and the Haitian military should be recreated. 13 months later, Aristide is ousted by a coup that he says is US, France, Canada backed coup. Haiti has been essentially under UN trusteeship since that time, and the Haitian military has been partly recreated. So everything that was reported on at the time that was discussed at this meeting transpires. So I did a Canadian newsstand search of major dailies in this country for a mention of the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. I could not find one single mention by a corporate reporter in the English language discussing the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti. So here you have the Canadian government literally plotting to oust an elected government of the most impoverished nation in the hemisphere. The coup is then responsible for thousands of people being killed, and no one in the corporate media, except a couple mentions by Haiti solidarity activists in broader opinion pieces, even bothered to ever mention the meeting, let alone do an investigative report into the meeting. So that's a pretty extreme example of bias in the dominant media, one that I go into in the book. Another example, a more recent example of bias in the dominant media on international affairs is, so the Green Party passed a resolution in support of boycott divestment sanctions on Israeli institutions profiting from the occupation. They passed that at their convention in August by more than 2/3 majority. It was also passed in an online poll in the lead up to the convention by a very strong majority. According to a Canada Land search, a media watchdog group in Toronto, Canada Land searched what it said is a couple dozen articles about the Green Party passing that resolution. They could not find not one of those articles quoted a proponent of the resolution. So even though more than 2/3 of the Green Party supported the resolution at the convention, many more pre-convention, all the stories quoted opponents within the party, notably Elizabeth May, or those outside of the party critical, people like the Israeli ambassador, challenging the resolution. And I actually did a couple of events 2 weeks ago or so with the author of the resolution, Dimitri Lascaris, and he described how he actually gave this, in one instance, he gave a very extensive interview to a Globe and Mail reporter about the resolution, what motivated the resolution, and nothing of his interview appeared in the paper the next day. So it's my contestation that there is an extreme bias in the dominant media on Canadian foreign policy issues. Actually, it's probably worse than most people who are already critical of the corporate media even actually realize. The book goes into some of the structural explanations for this bias, right? So questions of who owns the media. You know, obviously Canadian media is owned by a small number of major corporations, that it's some of the most consolidated or concentrated media among rich countries in the world. And I list examples in the book of owners intervening in the newsroom to shape foreign policy coverage. The most extreme example in recent years is the Asper family intervening in to make their papers even more anti-Palestinian than they already were. Another structural explanation is the revenue source of media outlets, right? Media outlets receive a lot of their revenue from advertising, which mostly comes from major corporations. And in the book, I go through some of the interests of major Canadian advertising companies in certain international affairs or international perspective. So for instance, the biggest advertiser probably over the past century in this country is General Motors. For much of that time, General Motors Defense was one of the biggest arms manufacturers in this country. So General Motors, of course, had a certain interest in Canadian militarism, a certain interest in a certain type of kind of aggressive Canadian foreign policy. So the interests of advertisers tend to seep into the newsroom. Also, in terms of a structural explanation for the bias in the major media is what are the information sources? So they're reliant on major institutions that can generate news. Probably the most important one is the Canadian military, which is the biggest PR operation in the country, which I'll get into in more detail in a second. Another structural explanation is that Canadian media is highly dependent on US wire services, right? A lot of the copy in Canadian papers comes from Associated Press, from New York Times, Washington Post, which tend to have a pro-US slant to their coverage. And media outlets, like other institutions, are responsive to pressure, right? They're responsive to pressure. So when you or I write a letter to the editor or make a phone call, it might have some impact. It has a lot more impact when a powerful individual does that, and it has even more impact when a powerful institution complains about coverage of international affairs. And in the book, I list a number of examples of military-backed organizations, pro-Israel organizations, and others running flat campaigns against media outlets when they're not happy with the coverage that they're receiving in those media outlets. The book also goes through some of the history, goes into a bit of the history of the Canadian press, right? The Canadian press, the major newswire agency in this country, was set up during World War I with a major subsidy from the federal government explicitly to get more pro-war coverage into Canadian media. And the Canadian press solidified itself as the main newswire agency in this country during World War II when they worked hand in glove with the military. In one instance, it was actually a military PR official working with a unit in Europe. One day he's doing PR for the military. The next day he's working for the Canadian press, still with the same unit. So just to give a sense of how close the ties between the Canadian press and the Canadian military have been historically. I also go into a bit about the ties between the Canadian foreign policy establishment and the CBC. So I go through some of the different strategies in recent wars. So during bombing campaigns, the Canadian military, recent bombing campaigns, the Canadian military has tried to very much suppress information, not allow reporters to interview the pilots engaged in those bombing campaigns. I'm talking about in Iraq in the early 90s, former Yugoslavia, late 90s, Libya 2011, Iraq, Syria more recently. The military has not allowed pilots to be interviewed. The justification for this has been that they're worried that pilots, that if their names appear in the paper, that their family members might be targeted back at home. So it's like a safety thing for pilots. But in fact, it's probably more to do with the fact that in terms of information in a bombing campaign, it's taking place at 25,000 feet above the sky. If you're not on that plane, you're very reliant on the military to release information. It's very difficult to gather information about what actually happened because it's so distant. But the military took a very different perspective with regards to Canada's main ground military campaign in recent years, notably in Afghanistan. Right? In Afghanistan, the military took the total opposite. They basically tried to bring reporters as close as possible, to have news gatherers see the war from the Canadian military's perspective. Of course, what I'm referring to is the embedding campaign, embedding reporters with the military, which I'm sure people are familiar with. And basically that was about bringing reporters to live on the base with the soldiers, to go out alongside Canadian troops when their light armored vehicles or their tanks went around to Afghan villages, etc. This is how Scott Taylor, military reporter, just described the embedding campaign in Afghanistan. He said, quote, "What would you say if the Romanian military occupied your town and a Romanian tank and journalist showed up at your door? You love the government they have installed and want these guys to stay. Of course, the locals are smiling when a reporter shows up with an armored vehicle and an armed patrol," right? It isn't that surprising, but we never heard the embedding campaign described like that in major media outlets. And so the military, like I said, took a very different position, has taken very different position with ground campaigns than air bombing campaigns. And none of this is haphazard, right? As I mentioned, the military is the largest PR organization in this country. They devote significant resources, time to thinking through different types of information control strategies during different type of campaigns, what they can get away with, technological changes, et cetera, et cetera. As part of the military's PR strategy, they obscure the scope of their PR strategy. As part of their PR strategy, they obscure the scope of their PR strategy. So we don't actually know how vast their PR exercises are, or the PR capacities are, operations are, but we know they're very vast. They're quite significant. And most of this information comes from Embassy Magazine. I believe there's chairs in the room next door if anybody wants a chair. So according to Embassy, access information document Embassy had uncovered from about 2010, the military spent $354 million on its PR operations and war commemorations. They devoted 661 staff members to those exercises. The Department of National Defense, according to an internal documents, has, quote, over 13 independent public affairs organizations just within the military. There's 13 different PR bodies, presumably dealing with different elements of the military's PR strategy. Online, you can find contacts for 50 different media relations offices. In 2012, the military monitored 29,519 newspaper articles. They compile information on what they've given, what information they've given to reporters, what information reporters have reported on, which reporters tend to be more sympathetic. You know, so who should we release information to? Who shouldn't we? The military operates dozens of publications. They spend $10 to $20 million a year on recruitment. They often spend 10, 20 plus $million commemorating specific wars and alongside other ministries. The military has a presence at Canada Day festivities, NHL hockey games, Santa Claus parades. So they have major kind of cultural outreach. So it is a vast PR body, both in the sense of the traditional PR dealing with the dominant media, also at the level of sort of cultural level. But it goes way beyond that. Beyond the military and its influence within academia, within think tanks, within the broader media, when you start looking at funding for social sciences programs, newly established social sciences programs at Canadian universities, it's amazing how many of them are set up with finances from wealthy Canadian capitalists, corporations, the Saudi king. In the case of the Saudi king, the Saudi king gave the University of Toronto $5.3 million in 2010 to set up something called the Chair for Dialogue Among Civilizations. In 2012, Qatar gave McGill's Institute of Islamic Studies $1.25 million. That year, David Azreli gave $5 million to Concordia to set up the Azreli Institute of Israel Studies. David Azreli is somebody who fought with the Haganah in 1948 in the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. He was personally engaged in that process. And Gerald Steinberg, a noted anti-Palestinian, described the donation to Concordia as a, quote, counterattack against pro-Palestinian activism at Concordia University. The oldest school of global affairs in this country, the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University, it was set up in the late 60s with in today's money, a $4 to $5 million donation from Norman Paterson, who was a Liberal Party senator, somebody who was very close to Lester Pearson, the lead architect of post-World War II Canadian foreign policy. And the initial head, and Norman Paterson School of International Affairs has incredibly close ties to external affairs, or foreign affairs, or global affairs Canada, as it's now called. The initial head was Norman Robertson, who was a long-standing Canadian diplomat, top official at External Affairs. And Norman Robertson continued to be on contract with External Affairs when he headed up the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. And in the book, I list all kinds of financial relationships between former foreign affairs people, Norman Paterson School, and many of the teachers at the Norman Paterson School are also former top Canadian diplomats. The most influential school of international affairs in this country is the Munk School of Global Affairs. Okay, are people familiar with Peter Munk? Some people? Only a few people? No? So Munk. So Peter Munk is the founder of Barrick Gold, right, which is the largest gold mining company in the world. And of 35 million Canadians, there are few that would be less credible in terms of being a source of support for the study of international affairs than Peter Munk. He is somebody who has significant personal stake in a certain type of Canadian foreign policy. So Barrick Gold has benefited from Canadian diplomatic support abroad, has benefited from Canadian aid money, has benefited from Export Development Canada support. Barrick Gold and Peter Munk have lobbied ferociously against any attempt to end public support for Canadian mining companies found to be engaged in major abuses abroad. So he has a personal major interest in certain type of Canadian foreign policy. He's also an extreme right-wing ideologue. Okay, so Peter Munk has said that Indigenous people around the world have way too many rights. It's a big problem. That gang rape is a cultural habit in Papua New Guinea because his security forces at his mine were engaged in gang rape. That Augusto Pinochet is a great guy who saved Latin America, etc. So he's on record on a whole number of fronts, saying very right-wing perspective on international affairs. As part of his initial $6.4 million donation to the University of Toronto, to set up, at that point it was called the Munk Center for International Studies, he made it so the U of T needed to receive advice from Barrick Gold's International Advisory Board. Okay, this is an academic institution receiving advice from a corporate advisory board. That included our good friend Brian Mulroney. The Barrick Gold International Advisory Board also included our good friend George Bush, Sr., the former US president, head of the CIA. Also, as part of his contract with the U of T, he didn't put all the money up front. So it was an installment, meaning that if he wasn't happy with the direction of the center, he could withdraw the rest of his funding. Peter Munk was happy with the direction of the Munk Center. He added another $5 million in 2006, and in 2010, he put up $35 million to set up the Munk School of Global Affairs, which, if people have been in the U of T campus, is right on Bloor Street, nice old building, quite nice location, etc. As part of the 2010 agreement that Peter Munk made with the U of T, he got the U of T to commit $39 million from its endowment. He also got the federal government and the Ontario government to put up a combined $50 million, and he receives a tax credit of about $16 million. So effectively, he puts up $19 million to mobilize about $100 million of mostly public funds for a school that he's had a great deal of influence over the direction of its sort of ideological kind of outlook. And it's been highly influential. It has close ties. It has a lot of resources, but it's also based in the media capital of the country. It's right downtown Toronto. So it has close ties to the Globe and Mail, for instance. The former head of the Globe and Mail, editor-in-chief, a couple days after he stepped down about a year ago, immediately had a position at the Monk School. Previous editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, same thing. Globe and Mail has a relationship with a journalism program, a relationship with the Monk School, etc. So it's been highly influential. It's also expressed a quite establishment outlook on international issues. It joined the Harper government's low-level war against Iran. In 2012, they received $250,000 for a project that was really about regime change in Iran. So they received that from Foreign Affairs. Again, this is an academic department at what is supposed to be one of the most prestigious universities in the country, receiving $250,000 from Foreign Affairs to engage in essentially a regime change effort in Iran. They've also opposed efforts to, or they've opposed the campaign to, or undermined the campaign to end public support for Canadian mining companies engaged in abuses abroad. The establishment of international development studies programs in Canadian universities is completely intertwined with our aid agency, which is, of course, an arm of Canadian foreign policy. So many of the early people who were involved in setting up IDS programs at Canadian universities had just been on CEDA projects, and more concretely, much of the funding to set these programs up came from CEDA, which wanted sources of support for the aid budget, effectively. That's the main interest from CEDA. Between 1986 and 2006, CEDA gave $250 million to Canadian universities. If you go on to the McGill's IDS website, you'll find that they list more than $1 million in contracts, funds from CEDA, from IDRC, International Development Research Center, which is just another arm of Canadian aid, from Foreign Affairs. This CEDA is not, while its political outlook would generally be better than the military, it's not in the business of challenging Canadian foreign policy, right? It's not in the business of funding challenges to Canadian foreign policy. That's not to say that there wouldn't be academics at programs funded by CEDA that wouldn't also be challenging Canadian foreign policy, but at a big picture level, CEDA is an arm of Canadian foreign policy, and CEDA has always resisted universities' attempts to have more independent sources of funding for their international work, because CEDA likes to have that leverage over universities, and their funding has definitely shaped IDS, International Development Studies programs. If you look at the major journals in the domain, you'll find that they're funded by CEDA. They say openly they're funded by CEDA, they're funded by IDRC, another arm of Canadian aid. And the book goes into a number of the arm's length organizations tied to CEDA, foreign affairs groups like the North-South Institute, which was set up in the mid-1970s with funding from CEDA. Explicitly to have an arm's length organization to campaign or to argue for increased Canadian aid budgets. And I'm not going to get into it in detail, but Canadian aid is not what most people think Canadian aid is about. It's been a geopolitical tool, first and foremost. Secondly, a tool to advance Canadian corporate interests. So North-South Institute groups like Rights and Democracy, Canadian Institute of International Peace and Security, both of those latter two organizations were set up by acts of parliament, entirely funded by Foreign Affairs, which of course puts some constraints on their ability to challenge Canadian foreign policy. During the war in Afghanistan, Le Devoir, what's usually viewed as a sort of progressive paper in Montreal, had a contract with CEDA to, quote, remind readers of the central role that Afghanistan plays in CEDA's international assistance program. So as part of the PR exercise in Afghanistan, Canada was putting hundreds of millions of dollars into Afghanistan. You know, there was a whole discussion about building schools so girls could now go to school, and that was supposed to justify our military presence in Afghanistan. But on top of that, the aid agency had contract with a major newspaper to have them go cover its projects in Afghanistan. Moving towards a conclusion, one rule of Canadian foreign policy, or ideas in Canadian foreign policy that you will not hear many places, is that the more impoverished a nation is, the greater the gap is likely to be between what Canadian officials say and do, right? So the weaker, more impoverished a place is, the bigger the lies Canadian government officials can tell us about what they're doing. Mostly because, to a large extent, power defines reality. And there's no better example of this than Canada's role in Haiti in the mid-2000s. Our government's involved in plotting the coup, executing, militarily speaking, the coup, backing the coup government that is responsible for thousands of people being killed. Our aid money was going to supporting the coup government, including top officials within the coup government were actually employees of CEDA and USAID. Our aid money was going to supporting a Haitian police force and Canadians, Sûreté de Québec and RCMP, that were training a Haitian police force that was responsible for going into the slum neighborhoods and massacring people, firing on unarmed demonstrations over and over again. So this was our aid. What our government was telling us is this was a sign of our benevolence to Haiti, to Haitians. But in fact, it was going to supporting the torturers of the majority poor in Haiti. But this was benevolence in this country. And you ask yourself, how is that possible that the gap between reality and perception could be so big? And it gets down to the question of what capacity do the victims of Canadian policy in Haiti have to tell the world their story of what Canadian foreign policy meant? To end, the main explanation for why there is not, why the bias is so stark in the dominant media, in beyond that, in ideological institutions more generally around Canadian foreign policy, is there isn't a countervailing force on foreign policy. There really isn't a countervailing force challenging the corporate elite perspective on Canadian foreign policy. On domestic issues, there is a bit of a countervailing force to the corporate perspective. Labor unions, most notably, right? Labor unions with many different problems do provide somewhat of an institutional check to the overwhelming power of the corporate perspective. That doesn't exist on foreign policy issues, and it's my opinion, or I know that if we want to push back against the 600 people working for the military and PR, the however many people, hundreds of people working for foreign affairs in PR, the probably into the hundreds of people working for the mining industry, global Canadian mining industry in PR, if we want to push back against that, we need to build that countervailing force. One of the things that I'm doing as part of this tour is setting up something called the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. Basically, it's going to be initially just an online hub of critical information around Canadian foreign policy, with time be a full-fledged left-wing foreign policy think tank that will produce reports, potentially even have chapters across the country. There's a sign-up sheet over there if people want to put their email down. So that's one piece of the countervailing force, but be it a left-wing foreign policy institute, be it rebuilding the peace movement in this country, be it the international solidarity organizations on Palestine, on Haiti, and mining solidarity, be it building up progressive independent media that's willing to challenge power on some of these issues. We need to build that countervailing force. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.